The wind whistled low through the throat of the valley, pushing the snow in thin, needle-like swirls that stung the skin like pins. It was the kind of cold that cracked lips and ripped the breath straight from your chest. Cold that even the varmints had surrendered to. Cade Merrick moved alone. His horse's bridle creaked with every step through brittle branches and frost-slicked brush. His coat, thick with mud and years of wear, slapped against his legs in rhythm with a march that led nowhere. He had crossed a broken fence, sagging under the snow and eaten up by rust. The horse, an old, graying animal, snorted wearily. Cade's eyes, sunken from loss and too many winters gone wrong, stared without seeing, until something caught. Along the edge of the creek, a shape, hunched and still, grabbed his attention. A brown lump, unmoving, too symmetrical, too still. He tugged the reins. The horse stopped, nervous. Cade dismounted in silence, boots crunching the icy crust. The wind gnawed at his cheeks, split open his knuckles. He drew closer. It was a sack, coarse burlap, soaked halfway through, its bottom frozen stiff. From within, a dark form pressed against the cloth. Then he heard it. A sound, faint as memory, a whimper, soft as a breath lost among the dead trees. Cade's heart stopped cold. He dropped to his knees, tearing off his gloves with clumsy fingers. Not from the cold, but from something older and deeper climbing up through his chest. He broke the frozen cords with bare hands and yanked back the stiff fabric. And there they were. 3 babies. 3 tiny, fragile creatures wrapped in damp rags, their faces tinted blue, their lips drained of color. One lay still. The other 2 trembled like leaves in the last gust of life. "Oh, Lord," Cade whispered, voice cracking. No one answered. He lifted them out, one by one, laying them across his spread coat. Their limbs were already stiffening, their lashes frosted with ice. The creek groaned behind him, like time itself was splitting apart. There was no time left. He stripped off his coat and wrapped all 3 in a single wool blanket soaked in desperation. Then, without thinking, he stepped out onto the ice. The creek shattered like glass beneath him. The freezing water bit into his bones, crawling up his spine like fire in reverse. He gasped. Death slithered up his back. The 3rd baby, the one that had drifted toward the bank, was nearly silent, barely tethered to life. Cade grabbed it, pressing it against the other 2 in the coat. He shivered. His clothes were soaked through. His feet felt like iron. His breath came in short, sharp bursts. But he moved, reached the shore, crawled with what little he had left. He climbed onto the horse, pressing the children against his chest. None of them cried. One made a faint sound, a whisper of breath. Another shook. Cade looked down at them and clenched his jaw. "Not today," he murmured. "Not today." He nudged the horse northward. The snow fell sideways, sharp. The trees blurred. Cade hunched over the fragile bundle, whispering nonsense. Half prayer, half madness. "Stay with me. Don't slip away now. Fight." One of the babies gave a soft cry. It was a thread of sound. But it was sound. Cade kicked harder. A silhouette emerged through the blizzard. A wooden structure, a lit lantern, a thin column of smoke. A roadhouse. Warmth. People. He didn't knock. Didn't ask. He burst through the door, coat soaked through, clutching the babies to his chest. Silence dropped in the room. The fire cracked in the hearth. One of the babies whimpered. Cade collapsed to his knees. "I need heat," he rasped. "They're still breathing." Inside the roadhouse, silence thickened like the snow outside. A few eyes followed Cade Merrick as he entered, drenched, shaking, a purpled bundle held tight in his coat. The fire snapped in the hearth, but no one moved. A woman dropped a mug that shattered on the floor. The barkeep, frozen behind the counter, muttered a curse. Cade knelt near the fire, legs stiff as boards. "They ain't dead," he gasped, "but they're close." The coat fell open, and there they were. 3 babies. 3 soaked, freezing little bodies, skin the color of copper, still clinging to a thread of life. "Sweet heaven," someone whispered. A man bolted upstairs, yelling for a doctor. Another tossed wood onto the fire. A young woman, barely more than a girl, knelt beside Cade. "Where did they come from?" she asked, but Cade didn't answer. His lips were purple, his eyes locked on the babies. One let out a tiny whine. "They're breathing!" the girl shouted. The back door slammed open. A wiry man in an apron, sleep still on his face, rushed in, wiping his hands with a cloth. Dr. Elias. "Make room," he barked. He examined them one by one. Pale skin, blue lips, rigid fingers. "They shouldn't be alive, but they are," he said. He called for blankets, hot bricks, sugar water, and silence. The girl held them to her chest, skin to skin. Cade, hands still trembling, did what he could. He'd lost his coat, his breath, but not his faith. Not yet. Hours passed. Their soaked bodies were dried. Sweet drops touched their lips. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls. The storm roared outside. At dawn, a sliver of sunlight broke through cracked planks. One baby, a tiny girl with sunken cheeks, moved a finger. The boy sneezed, faint. The third, the frailest, remained still. But she was breathing. "They'll need care," said Dr. Elias. "Even then, not all might make it." "Who leaves 3 babies like that?" an older woman asked through tears. "Who's got a soul that rotten?" No one answered. Cade didn't sleep. He stayed by the fire, eyes locked on the blankets. He didn't look away once. His clothes still dripped. In his gaze was more than exhaustion. There was guilt. There was memory. When folks offered him a cot, he turned it down. "Now what?" asked the bartender. "You gonna take him to Fort Redwell? The orphanage, you know? Hot meals, clean beds. They can disappear there." Cade stared into the fire. "They ain't livestock." "You're a cowboy, not a nursemaid," someone muttered, half laughing. "I'll find them a family," Cade answered. "But until then, they stay with me." No one argued, not out of pity, but because of something deeper. Something in his voice said that man wasn't about to give an inch. That very afternoon, he lit a stove in the small back room the innkeeper loaned him. He boiled water, bathed the babies with careful hands, wrapped them in flannel, turned a wooden crate into a cradle. He slept in a chair, boots on, one ear open. When the medicine ran out, he rode with the smallest girl tucked inside his coat, crossing the snow to the doctor's cabin. He came back with warm jars, teeth chattering. At night, he murmured soft things to them. "You're safe now. No one's gonna let you freeze again." One night, by the glow of the fire, the second little girl opened her eyes. Blue, clouded, but open. She looked at Cade. He didn't cry, but something inside his chest cracked. Slow, deep, irreversible. He touched her cheek. "You made it," he whispered. That night, Cade Merrick made a promise. He wouldn't leave them. Not like before. Not like he left his wife. Not like the daughter buried beneath the frost. No more running. No more loss. And when the doctor came back, holding a paper and a pencil, Cade already had names. The boy, Jack. The little one, Lily. And the one with the sky in her eyes, we'll call her Rose. They ain't mine by blood, Cade said to the fire, but they're mine by everything else. In the days that followed, the story spread through town faster than grease on a skillet. The cowboy who pulled 3 babies out of the ice. 3 Apache babies, no less. He's got 'em with him in the room out back. Opinions came quick. He's got no wife, no home, and now he's playing daddy to 3, said Samuel the banker, stirring his coffee at the cantina. Sure, he found them, but does that give him the right to keep them? Added Evelyn York, the widow always in black, with 2 marriageable daughters and too much judgment to spare. The questions stung like nettles under a wide-brimmed hat. Where had the children really come from? Why hadn't anyone claimed them? And why were they Indians? That weight didn't take long to land square on Cade Merrick's shoulders. The grocer refused him milk. The apothecary, who always had baby tonic, suddenly ran out of stock. Even the town kids, on their parents' orders, crossed the street when they saw him with the basket. Cade didn't complain. He didn't know how to cook oats without burning the bottom, but he figured it out. He heated rags on the stove, soaked them with melted snow, cleaned the babies' bodies with rough hands that had only known dust and rope. He slept little. Every breath from Jack, every whimper from Lily, every faint cry from Rose kept him on edge. And still, every time he looked at them, he knew it was worth it. One night, while changing Rose's damp cloth, he paused. "What if I can't do this?" he whispered to the dark ceiling. But by dawn, he was out chopping wood, hands cracked, eyes red from lack of sleep. There was no other choice. Some in town started seeing him differently. The innkeeper's daughter, still sneaking visits, left clean blankets by his door. A stable boy, without saying a word, handed him a sack of oats for the horse. The old town reverend, offering no explanation, left a jar of honey on the windowsill. Small gestures. Silent rebellions. Not everyone had chosen a side yet, but the battle had begun. On the 3rd Sunday after the rescue, Martha Caldwell appeared outside the general store. She wore her black cloak, hair pulled tight, and that voice sharp as a blade. "We cannot allow chaos to settle in our community," she declared to a circle of neighbors. 3 creatures with no names, no roots, no future, kept alive by a man with no family and no means, in the middle of winter. The murmurs supported her. "Food is short," added a woman from the ladies' committee. "Fever's going around. We've buried enough come thaw." "We don't need more mouths to feed," Martha concluded coldly. That very afternoon, Cade stepped into the square. His clothes were patched, his face more drawn than ever. His left arm hung in a sling, injured in the last snowstorm. But his voice didn't shake. "I didn't ask for this," he said from the roadhouse steps. "I didn't come looking for charity or praise. I saw a sack by the river, heard a cry, and pulled 3 souls from death." The square went still. They weren't mistakes. They were alive, and they still are. His eyes locked on Martha. "You don't have to like me, but I won't let them be called burdens while they're still breathing." No one replied. A man in the back broke the silence. "They'll die here, and when they do, it'll be your fault." Cade didn't flinch. "Then I'll carry it," he said, and stepped down, walked into the shadows, left behind a town split clean in 2. The cold that followed was crueler than the snow. Doors shut when he passed. Milk stopped coming. Words became blades. 3 mouths he can't feed. He should have left them at the river. The Indian who thought he could be a father. And still, he stayed. He didn't run. Because every night, when the fire died down and silence fell like ash, Cade leaned over the cradle. Jack breathed in his sleep. Lily curled up like she was searching for the warmth of the womb. Rose, barely a whisper, shivered when the heat faded. And Cade thought, as long as I breathe, I won't let them die. The snow was still falling when the roadhouse door slammed open. A blast of icy wind swept across the wooden floor. And there, framed by the white mist and held breath of the room, a staggering figure appeared. She wore a torn coat, soaked at the edges, her face flushed with cold and fever. Her breath came in short, rapid puffs. Her eyes, wide, dark, afraid, said everything. Cade Merrick rose slowly from his chair. The room held a single breath. I heard they found babies, the woman said, her voice cracked and raw. Her legs gave out. She collapsed to her knees at the entrance. The innkeeper's wife rushed to help her, but the woman raised a trembling hand. I need to see them, she pleaded. Please, they're mine. A wave of murmurs broke out. 3? Someone scoffed. You expect us to believe she birthed 3 and walked through snow after? She's crazy. She's here for money, you'll see, another snapped. Or worse. Cade didn't speak right away. He watched her in silence. Her coat was threadbare, her hands bruised and purple. But that wasn't what made him hesitate. It was the way she looked at the cradle. Not with greed, not with pride, with pain, a sorrow so deep it could only belong to a mother who had wept every night since her blood was torn from her arms. Cade stepped forward. He lifted Jack, still wrapped in his thin blanket, and walked toward her. If you try anything strange, he warned, his voice harsh. She nodded, tears already falling. When Jack touched her arms, the woman broke. She held him with a fierce tenderness. She rocked him, kissed his forehead, whispered words meant only for him. He was the last to come out, she whispered, but the first I held. He cried the loudest. Lily barely whimpered, and Rose was tangled up. They said she wouldn't make it, but she did. Cade stared hard at her. No one else could have known that. Your name? Ada, she said. Ada Redhawk. She looked down. I didn't leave them by choice. The silence in the room was as heavy as the snow on the rooftops. I worked a ranch on the East Ridge, she went on. Cheap labor. When the boss found out I was pregnant, and it was triplets, and they were Apache. A shiver passed through the room. Several crossed themselves. He said it was shameful, that folks would talk, that his name would be ruined. I begged him, told him I'd leave, raise them far away, in peace. But when they were born, they lied. Told me they died. Said I had no reason to stay. Her voice broke. I tried to die that winter, I swear. But something kept burning inside, and when I heard a man pulled 3 babies from the ice, I knew they were mine. She raised her eyes, straight at Cade. Please, let me take them home. The silence was brutal. Then, like a blade, Martha Caldwell spoke. How convenient, she said, arms crossed, chin high. She shows up now with tears and tall tales. They're mine, Ada snapped. I can tell you every mark, every freckle. Or maybe you're here to sell them, Martha spat. Or worse. Some nodded. Others stayed quiet. Cade didn't move. He turned toward the cradle. Lily and Rose had stirred. One of them, Rose, maybe, reached out her hand. And without meaning to, the 2 girls touched, fingers to fingers, like roots that had never truly been pulled apart. 3 lives, still too fragile to bear the weight of the world, held on to one another. Cade felt the blow, deep and slow. That moment wasn't an end. It was only the beginning of something harder, deeper, And inside, he already knew. No matter how many snows fell after this, those children would never be left behind again. Not while he breathed. That night, the wind whistled different. It wasn't the howl of cold, nor the moan of snow. It was a thicker whisper, like the dark was carrying knives under its breath. Inside the roadhouse, all was still. Jack slept on his back, fists clenched like he was still fighting to be born. Lily wore a tiny frown, pulled tight by dreams no one could understand. And Rose breathed in time with the fire, a faint melody, almost holy. Ada Redhawk watched them from the rocking chair someone had offered her. Her eyes were open, but she didn't cry. The tears were gone. Only the trembling remained, of someone who hadn't slept in days and had feared for years. Cade Merrick stood by the window, rifle within reach. The air was thick. The argument with Martha Caldwell, the stares, the doubt. It all lingered like heavy smoke. But something else was there, something unspoken, something slithering. The floor creaked, just once. Cade stiffened like a hound on alert. It wasn't the creak of old wood. It was different, human weight. He kept the lantern low and moved toward the back door without a sound. Another creak. He raised the rifle. When he opened it, he saw a shadowed figure, hooded, digging through the snow. A knife at his belt, moving straight toward the nursery window. Cade raised the rifle. "One more step," he said low and firm, "and it'll be your last." The man froze. He didn't reply, didn't even look back. He stepped away slowly, then turned and ran into the storm. Cade didn't chase him. He didn't need to. That man hadn't come to kill. He came to warn, to frighten. But there's something worse than threats. Intention. He came back inside. Ada was still holding Rose. "What happened?" she asked, eyes wide as saucers. "Nothing I haven't seen before," Cade replied, as he locked the door with a double bolt. They didn't sleep that night. By dawn, the word was already out. "A man tried to get into the baby's room. Cade faced him down with a rifle. He guarded the Indian woman like she was his wife." The rumors spread like ashes on the wind. "He's gone mad," some said. "He's in love," others whispered. But beneath the murmurs, something shifted. He wasn't just the cowboy who rescued the babies anymore. He was the man who drew a gun for them. And that, in a land hard and wary, carried weight. Ada barely spoke. She passed the days in silence, changing diapers, humming lullabies from her Apache childhood, rubbing Jack's chest when he coughed. One afternoon, as the sun died between the pines, she looked at Cade and spoke. "I'm scared." He didn't answer right away. They were alone, sitting near the fire, shadows dancing long across the walls. "I'm scared someone's going to say I'm not enough," she continued, "that I'll lose them again, that this time they'll take them for good." Cade moved closer, sat beside her, shoulders heavy, hands swollen from splitting logs and scrubbing blankets. "You won't lose them," he said, staring at the flames. Ada looked up. "How do you know?" "Because I didn't pull 3 children from death just to watch them vanish. And because, if you choose to raise them, you won't be alone." She had no words. "And if I decide it's too dangerous?" she whispered. Cade took a deep breath. "Then I'll raise them myself. I've done it this far. I'll do it to the end." Ada placed her trembling hand over his. "They're yours," she whispered. "And mine," he said. "Ours." That night, while the children slept and the wind rattled the window panes, Cade unrolled an old map. He smoothed it out with his hand and pointed east. There's a farm past the ridge. The Bensons. Quiet folks. They've got shelter. We can make it before the next freeze. Are you sure? Ada asked, glancing at her children's sleeping faces. As sure as I am that someone's coming back tomorrow at first light. She nodded. Then, we go. The night had not yet surrendered when Cade Merrick opened the barn door. The sky hung low, a smoky gray promising more snow. The ground cracked under his boots. The air smelled of smoke, wet wool, and farewell. They'd chosen to leave before sunrise. Their steps were slow, quiet, as if even the wind needed to forget them. Cade saddled his old horse, worn but loyal. He tied down the bedroll, then nestled Lily against his chest inside his coat, wrapped tight in blankets. Ada Redhawk followed behind, her face wrapped, Jack in her arms. The boy coughed softly, but often. The fever had eased, but not forgiven. In his half-sleeping eyes, a flicker of fight still burned. Behind them came Harris, a farmer who owed Cade a favor from years back. He drove a wooden wagon covered with canvas. In the back, resting on heated stones and buried beneath a hill of blankets, slept Rose, the frailest. No one spoke. The roadhouse vanished into the mist. The trees, bare and ghost-like, closed in around them like a silent procession. The wind, though mild, cut like a blade. Snow began to fall again. Slow, steady. The ground trembled beneath their steps, as if even the land knew this wasn't a journey. It was an escape. By evening they camped beside a half-frozen stream. Cade started a fire with numb hands. Harris melted snow in a blackened tin pot. Ada, her back aching from fatigue, rubbed Jack's feet to bring back their color. The boy's breath was shallow. His forehead burned. "I've seen this before," Ada murmured. "Too cold, too fast. He needs constant warmth." Cade nodded, not hesitating. He stripped off his shirt, pulled Jack against his chest, skin to skin, and wrapped them both in his coat. The boy shook. Cade whispered, "Stay with me, little one. Not today. Not today." The fire popped and hissed. The air smelled of fever and fear. No one slept that night. By morning, the trail had vanished. The snow had swallowed everything. No path, no tracks, no sign. Just white and willpower. Cade walked beside the wagon, leading the reins. Ada followed behind, cradling Lily, her eyes never leaving Rose. The smallest child didn't cough, didn't cry. She just breathed. Barely. On the third day, they camped between two oaks bowed with age. The sky closed in like a great mouth. Cade was gathering wood when he heard them. Voices, horses, dogs. "They've followed us," he said, jaw clenched. He ran to the wagon, tucked Lily inside his coat, grabbed the rifle, helped Ada onto the bench. Harris climbed up and took the reins. Rose was bundled tight, as if the world might crack in half. "Go!" A gunshot. Snow exploded beside the wagon. A horse screamed in the distance. Cade fired into the air, a dry thunder that echoed through the pines. The pursuers hesitated. The group crossed a frozen stream without thinking. The ice cracked beneath the hooves. Another shot, this one farther away. Cade turned. Aimed at the sky. Another shot, loud, deliberate. Silence. The voices stopped. An hour later they reached a homestead hidden among the hills. It belonged to an old friend of Cade's. He asked nothing. He simply opened the barn doors and lit the fire. Inside, clean hay and warmth. Rose stirred. Lily whimpered. Jack breathed more easily. Cade let himself slide down against the wall, his arms wrapped around Lily. He said nothing. He didn't need to. They had made it. For now. The refuge on the hill was safe, but not eternal. In the barn, among stacks of hay and warm bricks, the children began to regain their color. Jack slept more peacefully. Lily had started crying again, and that was a good sign. Rose was still fragile, but at least she responded to touch. Cade Merrick did not allow himself to rest. Every creak of wood, every misplaced shadow kept him alert. He knew that escaping was not enough. If they wanted real peace, they would have to face what they had left behind. And that meant returning to the law. Ada Redhawk, seated by the fire with Rose in her arms, understood it even before he said it. "We have to make noise," Cade murmured one night. "This time it's not enough to survive. This time we have to point to the one responsible." Over the following weeks, the group, Cade, Ada, Harris, and Clara, a traveling nurse who had treated the children, began gathering everything that might stand before a court. The soaked sack where the babies had been found, still kept, with a frayed red thread as a marker. Clara's medical notes, dangerously low body temperature, bruises, signs of neglect. Harris, a man of few words but a steady memory, led them back to the stream and pointed out broken branches, faint tracks, a smear of dried blood on a tree trunk. But what changed everything was a letter, a wrinkled sheet, hidden among Ada's belongings. It was brief. "End this scandal, or we will. No one needs to know there are 3 more mouths." Signed in the unmistakable handwriting of Martha Caldwell. They sent everything to a court in another county, beyond Martha's reach. They did not expect swift justice, but fate sometimes grows tired of waiting. A local journalist, Sarah Beck, received a copy of the file and published an article that changed everything. Thrown onto the ice, the 3 who survived the silence. The letters began to arrive. Mothers, teachers, preachers, neighbors from other towns. They demanded that the children be protected, that the one who tried to erase them be punished. The court announced a public hearing. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was filled to the edges. People from everywhere, some out of curiosity, others out of conviction. Martha Caldwell arrived escorted by 2 lawyers. She entered as always, chin high, with the gaze of someone who believes justice is a matter for the poor. "These people are unstable," one of her attorneys said, pointing at Ada and Cade. "They have no valid evidence, only rumors, accusations without legal weight." But one by one, the witnesses stood. A former maid from the Caldwell Ranch confessed that she heard Martha say, "Those children are a stain, better drowned than raised." An elderly midwife, trembling as she spoke, admitted she had been paid to keep silent. Even the town grocer, his voice shaking, confessed that he denied milk to Ada by direct order of Martha. Ada listened with reddened eyes, her back straight. Cade, solid as stone, did not speak a word more than necessary. Judge Preston Hale, his gray hair neatly combed and his eyes sharp, remained silent until the end. When Martha's lawyers tried to invalidate the letter, he lifted it. "Is this your handwriting, Mrs. Caldwell?" She did not answer. That night, vengeance came in the form of a stone. A rock shattered the window of the refuge. Rose cried. Cade went out with the rifle. Harris and Clara took the children to the cellar. Cade fired into the air. The shadows fled. But something had changed. At dawn, several neighbors arrived with lanterns, clubs, axes. They said nothing. They simply stood there, in a line, keeping watch until the sun rose. That morning, Cade held Lily in his arms. She did not cry. She only looked at him with those wide, trusting eyes, as if she had always known he would protect her. And then the judge spoke. "There is clear evidence of intentional abandonment. These children were nearly erased from the world. This court cannot allow such a crime to go unpunished." He turned to Cade and Ada. Mr. Merrick and Miss Redhawk risked everything to protect them. If she wishes to exercise motherhood, joint custody is granted. If not, full custody will pass to Mr. Merrick with full legal recognition. A murmur swept through the room. Martha Caldwell, red with fury, protested. Her lawyers did as well. But the judge's gavel came down hard. Justice served. When it was over in the courtroom, there were no cheers. No one applauded. But on the faces of those who heard the judge's gavel, something quiet was lit. Justice, yes, but also redemption. Martha Caldwell left surrounded by silence, her footsteps heavier than her pride. Her name, once a synonym for power, now fell like wet mud on the lips of the town. And then I wake up and they're there, laughing, with dirty cheeks and mismatched socks. And I can breathe again. Ada rested her head on his shoulder. "You're not alone in that," she whispered. "I see them too. Every time I fall asleep, I go back to the cabin, to the cold, to the sound of the door closing." "But we're not there anymore," he said. "No, not anymore." One Sunday, the neighbors came without invitation. They brought a long table, benches, a barrel of cider. No one explained anything. They simply sat down, shared food, and let the children play freely. As the sun set, someone pulled out a harmonica. Another, a guitar. And without anyone planning it, they sang. Cade didn't sing, but Ada did. And when she did, she sang in her Apache tongue, slowly, like someone soothing an old wound with a warm palm. People didn't understand the words, but they didn't need to. The feeling was as clear as creek water. Jack clapped. Lily spun in circles. Rose fell asleep in the arms of Clara, the nurse, a flower still tucked in her hair. That night, when everyone had gone, Cade stepped out onto the porch. The sky was clear. The moon shone full. Ada came closer, a shawl over her shoulders. "Everything all right?" "Yes," Cade answered. "I'm just grateful." She leaned against the wooden post, looking towards the horizon. "I never thought this land could give us something good. Maybe it wasn't the land. Maybe it was us." She nodded. "And now? What comes next?" Cade looked at her. "Whatever comes, but we won't have to run anymore." She smiled. "Or hide anyone. Or quiet their laughter," he added. Inside, the children slept together, wrapped in soft blankets and dreams no longer made of ice. Summer arrived without hurry. But it arrived. The creek ran clear, the hills gleamed beneath a wide sun, and the small house that Cade Merrick and Ada Redhawk had built with tired hands now seemed a natural part of the land, as if it had always been there. The children grew as if winter had never existed. Jack ran ahead of the old horse, pretending to be a brave cowboy. Lily collected shining stones from the creek and kept them as sacred treasures. And Rose, always quiet, always watchful, walked with small but steady steps, gripping Ada's hand. Cade watched them from the porch as he sharpened a knife against the stone. Each movement was slow, deliberate, almost meditative, not because the blade needed sharpening, but because he needed to remember he still had that luxury. Stopping. "You've changed," Harris said one afternoon when he came by with a sack of flour. "For better or worse?" Cade asked. Harris smiled, the kind of smile only men who have seen too many storms carry. "To live." Cade didn't answer, but deep down he knew it was true. That house, those 3 children, even Ada, all of it had put down roots in him he had never dared imagine. The days passed without haste. The smell of fresh bread filled the kitchen. Ada hung medicinal herbs from wooden beams, humming old melodies that turned the house into a warm refuge. Cade built a new fence around the garden. Lily helped by plunging her hands into the soil. Jack stood guard at the corral gate, as if he were already a man. And Rose watched everything with that deep stillness that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. One afternoon, as the sun dropped behind the pines, Ada called Cade down to the river. "I want to show you something," she said softly. They walked together along the path by the water. The air smelled of rock rose and rosemary. On a flat stone, Ada placed 3 small hand-woven ribbons, one for each child. "In my people," she explained, "we did this to remind them where they come from, not to anchor them to the past, but so they won't fear the future." Cade touched them with his fingers, with a tenderness that surprised even him. "I didn't know they needed something like this," he said. "We all do," Ada replied. "Even you." There was a long silence, but not an uncomfortable one. "Cade," she whispered, "are you afraid?" He thought about it. The wind rippled the water in gentle waves. "I'm afraid of losing them," he finally said. "Then you are a father," Ada said, smiling for the first time in days. And they stood there, listening to the river that had once nearly taken everything from them. In late August, the town held a small fair. It wasn't much: sweetbread stalls, a tired violinist, children running about. But it was the first time Jack, Lily, and Rose set foot in a place full of noise and life. Some neighbors approached shyly. "They're strong," an older woman said, looking at Rose. "They're happy," Cade replied. And it was true. The children laughed, and the laughter spread like a bright echo beneath the canvas tents. Jack won a small wooden horse at one stall. Lily smeared her face with honey. Rose, in Ada's arms, reached toward the lanterns. For a moment, impossible to measure, impossible to hold, Cade realized something. The ice was no longer chasing them. There was no shadow left of the cold that had almost destroyed them. Only warmth. Only life. That night, when they returned to the cabin, Cade stepped out onto the porch. The sky was so clear it looked like glass. Ada came to stand beside him. "Today was a good day," she said. "Yes," he replied. "Do you think we deserve this?" Cade didn't answer right away. He looked inside. The 3 children slept together, as if they were one single beating heart. "I think," he said at last, "that they deserve it, and that we are learning to deserve it too." Ada rested her head on his shoulder. "And now what?" she asked softly. Cade looked at the lights on the horizon, the calm of the creek, the mountains that had watched them be born as a family. "Now," he said, "we keep living. But tell me, how would you like this story to continue?" Final question for readers. If you were Cade or Ada after everything they lived through, would you stay in that house by the creek or keep searching for an even safer place for the family? If this story moved you, we invite you to join us in discovering more real stories from the Old West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit God placed in those who opened the way. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once more to walk this untamed land. Thank you.